So thank you for having me today. I'm pretty much like the sub for the Department of Labor. Scott, here's your topic. Fortunately, I have a piece that's just something to follow for keeping a 403B plan kind of in line and kind of managing your fiduciary exposure. But I thought it'd be good to take a step back because Peter covered a lot of my thunder as far as fiduciary pieces, so I wanted to add a couple things from listening to what Peter said. We've come a long way from the early 1960s when the first 403B plan showed up. Those arrangements were set up as individuals directly with an investment company and were really not structured like a group, like a 401k or an employer-sponsored 403B was today. So you had individual vendors and you could have one not-for-profit with 5, 10, 15 vendors. And then fast forward to today, where if you're in an ERISA plan, you don't really come across that situation any longer because somebody's going to have to be responsible for overseeing the investments and managing all the different vendors that are available. So do they want to do the work on 5 or 6 different vendors, or do they want to do the work just on one vendor? And so we've had a giant focus. The other way around as well has been the investment choices. Back in the beginning, you probably had just one investment choice, some sort of a GIC or a fixed account. Now that's evolved to, in the mid-1990s, 4, 5, 6 investment choices, and your plan was cutting edge. And fast forward today, where you would normally see 25 to 35 investment choices in the plan. So it's 401k get the majority of the press today, but 403B plans have predated 401k plans by over 20 years. And so that's the interesting part about how long it took for the 403B regs to be rewritten a couple of years ago, a few years more than just a couple of years ago, was that there hadn't been any updates to the 403B regulations since the early 1960s. So, I mentioned where we are today. Education, and the evolution of fiduciary liability, fiduciary responsibility. All those in the room here that are auditors are aware that 10 years ago, you didn't have to go into anywhere near the details that you do today. And 10 years ago, you weren't necessarily signing away your life with what you were signing, where today, you're having to go a lot deeper in your audits. And the audits are conveniently attached to the 5500 for the world to see. So once it's been put there, you have a liability. So it's how to manage or control that liability and helping your clients manage or control that liability. And as a not-for-profit as well, it's recognizing that although right now there's named fiduciaries in the plan, coming down the pipeline right now is the DOL's new definition of what a fiduciary is. And it won't necessarily be like before, which is someone who's written into the document as a fiduciary. It may be that someone falls as a fiduciary just by their actions in regards to the plan. So somebody working on the investments, right now they may not be recognizing themselves in a fiduciary capacity, but after the DOL gets through with the new definitions, they may very well be a fiduciary even though they're not putting in writing or recognizing themselves in that capacity. And so take a second to let that sink in, because that's going to also be used to kind of expand the scope of the Department of Labor from just qualified employer-sponsored retirement plans out into IRAs. And so the tidbit that I can give you today is become familiar with the Retail Investor Protection Act of 2015. Has anybody heard of that? That was actually passed yesterday by the House. There'll be a new acronym, RIPA, RIPA, or RIP. So this is actually the House saying we want to have a 60-day wait period before the DOL can take action on redefining a fiduciary. So then the SEC will be able to finish their work on defining a fiduciary first. And then the DOL can actually, instead of just kind of creating it on their own without taking input from the industry, will actually have to look at the guidance that the SEC provides on this. Now, of course, this may just die. The Senate may not take this one up. But then again, the president has vowed to veto that because they again want to push through the definition of fiduciary and the changes that they would like to see that may very well be independent of what the industry experiences firsthand. So we have a big evolution from fee disclosure, and I know Peter talked about 408B2, 404A5. You heard that ad nauseum for 2 or 3 years prior to that actually being passed. The next step is really retirement readiness. And you'll hear them use those words that that's their focus. And what that means is they're recognizing that roughly 42 million Americans don't have retirement plan accounts, employer-sponsored retirement plans accounts. So they're looking at solutions on how to get them into some sort of retirement plan. So you've heard of some of the states coming forward and creating the state plan, which is sort of working against the employer-sponsored plans that are today. And then 401ks get a lot of bad press. There's a particular economist that says it's a failed system, that it's not working. Of course, we're all experiencing participants that are saving money successfully inside of the plan, so it's not a failed system. Maybe it's finding a way to capture some of those others without throwing everyone else's plans under the bus. But I wanted to mention that you'll see more and more about retirement readiness and the approach that plan sponsors are no longer uninvolved with the participants and their 401k, that they're looking at the plan sponsor doing things that are in the best interest of the participant. So doing things like auto-enroll. Auto-enroll on the 401k side is becoming more and more common. On the not-for-profit side, it's still kind of a, in effect, a 4-letter word to take money out of people's checks. Even though you're notifying them, it's still sort of not in the culture that I would see very often auto-enroll. It's discussed quite frequently, but keep in mind with universal availability and the employees eligible to enter the plan right away from date of hire, it adds some challenges to auto-enroll as far as notification. But you'll see some things coming down the pipeline that have to do with a plan sponsor's role in taking on a more paternal approach. And so I look at this as kind of like health insurance, and I'll equate it back. My first job out of college at a third-party administration firm in 1992 was a multiple employer trust that had a big self-funded type plan, and it evolved into a PPO type plan, and then suddenly overnight it evolved into an HMO, and HMOs came around. So now HMOs have run their course and it sort of cycled back through to self-funded plans, which are really kind of where it started, when I first got into the retirement plan industry. So everything kind of circles back around. So where I'm going with this is that there were traditional pension plans or money purchase plans. Then it became defined contribution plans, employees taking part in their retirement instead of it all coming from the employer. Now we're kind of circling back around to where the employer is expected to be more paternal and doing things that are in the best interests of the employees. Looking at a plan and saying that we have 80% participation, so we're doing great, but 2/3 of those employees are putting away 2%. You've got a sort of a number that was really common how you measured the success of a plan, but now you got to look at it a little bit differently. What is the replacement at retirement? And that seems to be where everything is going. I wanted to touch on, before I go into this minimizing fiduciary risk, I wanted to touch on PPA restatements. PPA restatements are a chance for the third-party administrator or the vendor to interact with their client and provide value-added as far as consulting. Because the PPA is not just as simple as some vendors, maybe those payroll companies out there, will take and just say, here, sign this. And this is the PPA restatement. And they don't go through the changes. They also don't go through to clean up what's written into the plan that doesn't need to be written into the plan any longer. They're not providing any consulting. And the big things in PPA and the big things that I see that we make sure that we would hash out in the very beginning on a restatement is the definition of compensation. And that's one of the most difficult things, because you go into a plan sponsor, you can't just assume that they recognize their definition of compensation. You have to ask them things like, are there any taxable reimbursements? Are there any other, car allowances? Okay, if there's a car allowance, are deferrals based on that as part of W-2 income? Or are they excluded? But there's a whole little list of little items that could very well be needed to be included in definitions of compensation that are not included in the definition of compensation. And it's not clear. Also, clarifying things like the match. What we're finding when we've done restatements, we're coming across a number of plans that are running their plan that the match is based on a per payroll period, per paycheck. So that's fine. Someone but someone puts away $15,000 or $16,000, $18,000 in the first quarter and they can no longer receive a match, they're going to miss out on what they would have received had they deferred throughout the year. But they're writing it as if there's a true-up that doesn't have to be done, but if you have a match calculation based on the end of the plan year, even though they advanced their contributions in the first quarter maxed out, you're going to owe them additional match at the end of the year when you calculate their census. And that's probably the most common thing that we find is that they're not familiar with their matching formula. And this is how we've always done, is what we'll hear as we're restating a new client coming over. This is how we've always done. And I'm the bad guy in that I try to be empathetic, but I say that just because it's how you've always done it doesn't mean that you're doing it the right way. And then we can work on solutions to correct it going forward and make it right, and then we can work with our clients on solutions going backwards to make whole who needs to be made whole. But I wanted to mention that because PPA is sort of glossed over by a lot of the different providers out there, and it's an awesome consulting opportunity for a vendor or a TPA, but a lot of these little details are overlooked. And then they come back around and they become much bigger issues 2-3 years down the road when you receive an audit letter and then they're wanting this information, and then that's when you figure out, ooh, we haven't been matching on an annual basis, we've been doing it on a per pay period. That could be a pretty substantial amount over the course of 2 or 3 years, plus the time involved with making that kind of correction. So minimizing fiduciary risk, as I mentioned, Peter kind of stepped over a big chunk of the fiduciary type pieces that this is focused on, but I wanted to pull a couple of the bullet points. The things like on page 3, the exclusive benefit rule, the prudent person rule, investment diversification, and then consistency with plan document. Well, I just kind of highlighted the consistency with plan document, number 4, with my example with PPA, and administering the plan like the document's written, not necessarily like you've always administered it. In other words, there could be a difference. The exclusive benefit rule with not-for-profits are generally about taking care of their employees the same way they're taking care of their clients. But the plan has to be for the exclusive benefit of the participants. You don't see that in a not-for-profit, but in a for-profit, sometimes we're reminding the plan sponsor that this isn't your personal plan, and your decisions that you're making can't be based on what's best for you. It's got to be based on what's best for the participants overall. And then it's something that you've got to be prepared to defend. If you're making decisions that may kind of borderline that's not in the participant's best interest, be prepared to defend why you're taking that particular approach as a plan sponsor. The prudent person rule, I've heard this come back around. The prudent man, which is now updated to the prudent person. That means that you doing your best to fulfill a role, for example, on the investment choices, if you don't have the expertise, then you really are not a prudent person. You're not able, you don't have the skill set. And I'll give you an example, just because you're an attorney does not necessarily make you an expert in 401k plans. A litigation attorney, it doesn't necessarily make you an expert in 401k plans. And so it's making sure that you realize that somebody is on the hook for the investment choices in the plan and that they have a personal liability. So that's something that many not-for-profits are focused on providing services to the community, and sometimes they don't realize that there's some things that they really need to cover themselves as far as who's making the decisions about the plans, and recognizing that they need to have that expertise to act in that capacity. Either that or partner with an advisor that is able to provide that expertise to you as a plan sponsor. The investment diversification, again too, the focus has been on helping employees do what's best for themselves. So where prior to the establishment of qualified default investment alternatives, you had the default fund would be a fixed account. And the fixed account might be paying, at the time, 3% as a net rate of return. And that was the default fund. Well, they came out and said that's really not in the best interest of the participant to put them in something that's guaranteed that may not be appropriate for their age or their investment risk. So they established this qualified default investment account. So what you end up having is a default where you can default employees and have some protection from the Department of Labor because you've made this default into this investment choice. So it's been a kind of an evolution from, you know, putting them into the fixed account, and because it's an interest-bearing account, saying, hey, my hands are clean on this, to where you actually now have protection to put them into something like a target date fund or a risk-based fund that you wouldn't have just defaulting them into a cash account.
Who defines the scope of those default options?
So there are definitions that would be the equivalent of a target date fund or a risk-based fund, an asset allocation type fund.
So the employer just chooses one of those? Or?
Yeah, generally the vendor or platform will say, you know, these are what you could use as the QDIA. So you'll see a lot of times it could be target date funds, it could be managed account portfolios are the QDIA. Or it could just be a straight risk-based fund, a moderate allocation fund or a balanced fund. But it would generally fall in with you know, relying on the vendor on what you're able to use. Or your advisor. Your advisor is able to provide some guidance on what to use as a QDIA.
So some judgment has to be used.
Correct. Could it be the Invesco Technology and Science Fund? You know, probably couldn't use that as a default, although it may have great performance in some years. It wouldn't be appropriate, you know, level of risk for everyone. Yeah, I mentioned the fiduciary liability on page 5. You know, let's get personal. It really is about making sure that the fiduciaries are aware of what their role is. Many are sitting in a committee for the 401k or the 403b plan, but they may not be aware that by being a part of that committee, they may be exposed as personally liable for, you know, breaches of their fiduciary capacity. And that's something that, you know, reiterating with plan sponsors, and as Peter said, making sure that it's clean and you're eliminating out prior fiduciaries. And it's not uncommon to come on and there's 4 fiduciaries listed in the document, 3 of them are gone. Well, guess what? Those 3 still have that same liability until they're removed from the document. And so they still have exposure even though they're no longer there. And as Peter mentioned, they also have access to be able to go to the vendor and request information about the plan, even though they're no longer in that capacity with that not-for-profit or for-profit.
I presume they could protect themselves by notifying the provider that they're no longer there?
That would be, yeah, I remove myself as a fiduciary and have it in writing that you're removing yourself as a fiduciary. If you're the only fiduciary, you may not be off the hook until you have another fiduciary to replace you as fiduciary. There's actually been situations where a fiduciary tried to get out of being a fiduciary in the plan any longer, and well, there needed to be somebody as a fiduciary. And so they're like, no, you can't back out as a fiduciary until you have a replacement. So, and it'll, you know, a company goes out of business, it'll still go back to whoever is listed as a fiduciary. And so it's you know, it's a contract, you know, and you're putting yourself in a situation where you're providing some sort of a role to a plan sponsor.
Yes, the topic is let's get personal.
That's what I said, let's get personal. You'd be surprised the number that don't realize what their actual liability is. They think that there's some sort of protection that, no, you're as a fiduciary, you know, you're personally liable. So not-for-profits don't have trustees, you know, versus a 401k which has trustees. I'd say 99.9% of not-for-profits don't have trustees because they don't need to have trustees defined in the document, but they do have fiduciaries. And fiduciaries have the same exposure, the same risk as a trustee. So although there aren't trustees, there are fiduciaries. And so, you know, making sure you know who's in that capacity.
In the example I mentioned earlier, my being CFO, was I a fiduciary?
Well, and actually that's one of the notes that I had to make sure that I covered while we were talking. The plan that you were in, and I'm just going to guess from talking about it, if it's employee deferral only with no employer contributions, and it's been around for a while, it's probably a non-ERISA voluntary 403b plan.
I assume so.
So what that means is that the plan sponsor doesn't have that same fiduciary liability for monitoring and selecting the investments. It's actually opposite. The plan sponsor wants to completely stand clear of any discussions about doing anything to narrow the scope of the vendors and really leave it to the participants. Now granted, there may be vendors that were already brought in, but standing clear of anything to do with monitoring the investments on that type of a plan. It doesn't require a Form 5500. It doesn't require an audit. It's a separate entity that you really kind of, if you make any decisions in regards to narrowing down vendors, then you would be actually taking on a fiduciary role, and you would make that non-ERISA plan into an ERISA plan. So it's very, with a non-ERISA plan, very careful to make sure that you're following the rules, that you're staying away from providing any kind of fiduciary role. Now, with the new definitions of a fiduciary, that may very well change, but as it stands right now, there's states like California where, like school district plans, you go to 403B-WISE, I think is the website, and it'll list out 36 different vendors that the teachers can choose from for their 403B. They have to offer them, if they make the list, they have to offer them to everyone. And a lot of vendors that you've never heard of, Northwestern, Southern, Montana, Mississippi Life would be a good example of that. Working in the industry a while, and I've just made that up. But you'll have some pretty wild names for some of the vendors that you would see in that. I'm generally pure, as most of you or all of you are, employer-sponsored retirement plans. So, 401k or 403b. The other type of non-ERISA 403b plan would be a church plan. And so you don't have to file a 5500. You don't have to test contributions going into it except for making sure they don't go over the individual limits. You can do pretty much anything inside of the plan. You can change the definition of full-time. You don't like 1,000 hours, you can make it 1,500. You're able to do what you want inside of the document. But you still have a fiduciary responsibility in regards to the monitor of the investment choices. So you still have a role that you would take. A vendor is going to run it like an ERISA plan and run it through the same processes, although they're not going to have to do a 5,500 ultimately for it.
Thank you.
There you go. So the other items, votes. So, and actually there was a little bullet point on page 7 in the upper right-hand corner. Well, some professionals maintain that state fiduciary rules don't technically apply to non-ERISA 403b plans. Don't mistakenly believe that you would not have some sort of liability should you act haphazardly regarding your plan's investments, particularly if the action resulted in loss to employees.
Sounds like fiduciary responsibility to me.
Correct. Correct. Again, they're encompassing fiduciary to expand beyond the qualified plans to actually the rollovers from the qualified plans to IRAs. So you may ask yourself, well, how are they going to track down those to look at those to make sure there's no prohibited transactions? Well, they're actually going to audit the IRA custodians, and they're going to play the game where they look at the rollover, where did this come from, and then trace it back to the source plan. Now, to give you an idea of the extent of the fiduciary rule changes that they're proposing, if inside of the plan the compensation is 25 basis points, outside in the IRA, if the compensation is greater than 25 basis points, it would probably be deemed to be at the detriment of the participant for the advisor to roll them from being in a fiduciary